Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about the greatest common factor. If you don't know what a factor is, I recommend watching the previous video that talks about factors. Basically, a factor is a number that can divide a number without giving you a remainder. So you need to know how to do that before you can find the greatest common factor. So let's look at this example. It's asking us what is the greatest common factor of 12 and 16. So it's in the name of what they want you to do. They want you to find the greatest common factor. So first off, we need to find out what are the factors of these two numbers, 12 and 16. So let's list out the factors of 12 and 16. Remember, what are the numbers that can divide 12? Well, one of the ways you can find that out is, by using division. But another way is to just list the ways that you can multiply to get 12. So in this case, 1 and 12 will give 1 times 12, right? Those two numbers can divide 12. A 2 and a 6 can divide a 12, and a 3 and a 4 can divide 12. So those are actually our common factors, right? Those numbers, you can divide 12 by any of those numbers and you will not get a remainder. Now let's go with 16. The common factors of 16, the factors of 16 are 1, 16, right? 1 can divide 16, 16 can divide 16. 2 and 8, 2 can divide 16, 8 can divide 16, and 4. So those are the factors of 12. Those are the factors of 16. Next question we want to ask ourselves is which factors do they have in common? So let's look at both numbers and let's see which ones they have in common. So if we look closely, right, they both have the number 1 in common. So that means 1 can divide a 12 and 1 can divide a 16. 2 in common, so 2 can divide 12 and also 2 can divide 16. 3, no, because 3 can divide 12, but 3 is not listed here, so 3 cannot divide 16. If you try to divide 16 by 3, you will get a remainder, so that's why it's not a factor. See, 4 is a factor. 4 can divide both of these numbers, and it will not result as a remainder. It won't give us a remainder. So we can list them out. Which ones do they have in common? Well, they have in common a 1, a 2, and a 4. Right, so that's the part where they talk about common, like common. Then lastly, it just says the greatest, right? So if we look here, which is the greatest from all of these? Right, if we look, the greatest one is the number 4. So 4. So we can say 4 is the greatest common factor of 12 and 16. So 4 is the greatest common factor, or GCF, of 12 and 16. Here, 16. So that's basically what greatest common factor is. You list out all the factors of the numbers, see which ones they have in common, and you pick out the greatest. So the purpose of that is to find out the biggest number that can divide both of them without giving you remainders. In this case, 4 is the number that can divide both of them without giving us a remainder. But not only that, but 4 is the biggest number that they have in common. And that's basically the greatest common factor. Let's do another example. Here's an example of how you might see it also, where they just have like GCF, right, greatest common factor, and they have parentheses and two numbers in there. So they want you to find the greatest common factor of these two numbers. So as before, you start off by first finding the factors. So let's list out the factors. Here's 9. So one way to find the factors is list all the ways you can get 9 through multiplication. So 1 and 9, and 3 and 3. Remember, 1 divides 9, 9 divides 9, 3 divides 9. Now let's look at 15. 1, 15, and 3 and 5. I think that's it. So each of these have a few of them in common, but which ones do they have in common? Right, they have the number 1 in common. So let's write that down. Or let's circle first the ones they have in common. So they have 1 in common and 3 in common. So what are the common factors? Which ones do they have in common? Which ones do they share? Well, 1 and 3. The number 1 can divide 9 and 15. The number 3 can divide 9 and 15 without giving us a remainder. Now, which one is the greatest, right? So which is the greatest? Well, 3, right? 3 is the greatest common factor, GCF, of 9 and 15. Pretty simple. But it gets easier with more and more practice. We'll try one more example. Let's see. Example. So once again, you'll probably see it where it just says GCF. And then you have the two numbers that they want you to work with. So 24 and 11 in this case. All right. Oh, in the previous example, we can actually go back and just write down it is going to be 3. Now, last example, just like before. With practice, you'll probably get even faster at this, and you might not even have to list out all the multiples, but I always say list them out just, when you're starting off, when you're getting enough practice. So 24 actually has several factors. So again, to find all the factors, just list out the ways you can get 24. So 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. What about 11? 1 times 11. And that's it. Now we need to see which ones do they have in common. Well, they have in common a 1. 1 is always, they always have 1 in common. And if we look through the list, there are no other factors that they both share, right? So 2 can divide 24, but 2 doesn't divide 11. That's why it's not there. It's not a factor. So we can just say that the greatest common factor is just 1, right? So the GCF of 24 and 11 is 1. Now there's a lot of stuff that goes into like why is it 1, what does that mean, and we'll talk about that. There's also different applications. There's ways to use this like in real life examples, like when you're trying to make groups, like if you have 20 red marbles and 18 blue marbles, how many groups can you make? What's the greatest number of groups that you can make? And we'll talk about that later on, but for now this is just greatest common factor. Finding the biggest number that can divide two numbers that you are given. In this case, 12 and 16, the biggest number that can divide both of them is 4. For 9 and 15, the biggest number that can divide both of them is 3. And finally, for 24 and 11, the biggest number that divides both of them is just number 1. Alright, so hope that helps with greatest common factor. Please try these out on your own. And if that helped, please give this video a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.